Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to day 4 of the GIAN course. We now begin our second session for the day, where Professor Stefan Helgason will speak on looking back at apartheid in South Africa, examining the works of Jacob Dlamini, Antjie Krog, and Ivan Vladislavić. But before we begin, here are some important points to keep in mind. Please post your questions in the chat box. They will be addressed during the tutorial session. Your attendance is being recorded, and the session is also being recorded for reference. There will be no break during the session, but if Professor Helgason prefers a short pause, we will accommodate with it. The tutorial session will take place from 9:30 p.m. to 9:50 p.m., where we will engage in further discussion based on the lecture. Now I invite Professor Stefan Helgason to begin his lecture. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Sadia. Yes, this will be a slightly shorter session. I need to end at 9:50 your time sharp. But there is also a tutorial tomorrow. So if you have any further questions you'd like to ask, we can address them then and there. Right. So let's begin. If you can project my slides. Excellent. Yes, so with this lecture, we are in many ways sort of returning to my home base. This is a literary context I've worked on for many years, and if our previous session on Gandhi's printing press had, shall we say, a more historical emphasis, this will have a more literary emphasis, but history comes into it the whole time, obviously. Next slide, please. So what I'll be doing in the following hour or so is to say something about developments in South Africa, especially since the official ending of apartheid in 1994. It's been a very exciting period, those now almost 31 years, but also extremely complicated and contradictory. And then I will say something about Experiments with Truth, this book by Hedley Twiddle, which sort of provides the lens through which I then discuss these three writers, Antjie Krog, Jacob Dlamini, and Ivan Vladislavić. Then I have some closing remarks that will sort of sum up a number of things we have been thinking about in this lecture and also the previous ones. Fine. Next slide, please. Right. So this is a contemporary map of South Africa. It looks quite different from the colonial one and the apartheid one. Under apartheid, South Africa was divided into 4 provinces. Now there are an additional 2 or 3. They've sort of carved up the country differently. So as you know, and I can't go into any detail there because that would be yet another lecture, but apartheid, that very particular and disastrous way of organizing South African society had its official beginning in 1948, when the Nationalist Party gained power. I think a detail that is important to remember to understand the historical dynamic of South Africa is that there have been like two major groups within the white population: the English-speaking South Africans and the Afrikaans-speaking South Africans. And Afrikaans is derived from Dutch, so this has to do with Dutch colonization. And between these groups, there has been a lot of tension, and this was one reason behind the South African War at the last turn of the century. So if we just fast forward, apartheid sort of hardened over the decades, and became a very rigid system, buttressed by literally hundreds of laws that restricted the movement of the African population and restricted their possibilities in life. So it was a profoundly unjust society. The 1970s then are a very important decade. And I mentioned Black consciousness, I think, earlier today, yes. And in 1976, there was the Soweto uprising, which was strongly influenced by Black consciousness. And from then on, the anti-apartheid, the domestic anti-apartheid movement gathered in strength. 1990 is the next very significant year. This is when the ANC and also other parties like the PAC, the Communist Party, were unbanned, because they'd been banned ever since 1960. And Nelson Mandela, the iconic freedom fighter, was released, and would, after a very difficult few years of negotiations and political violence, would lead the country to its first democratic elections in 1994. This is sometimes known as the miracle of South Africa, but it was really the result of very hard work and a handful of wise leaders, actually, a constellation, a fortuitous constellation of wise leaders on both sides that understood that they had one chance now to arrive at a democratic dispensation, or see the country descend into civil war, basically. Shortly after 1994, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up, and this was intended to address very directly the horrifying legacies of political violence in South Africa. It was even-handed to the extent that there were also hearings that dealt with certain power abuses by the ANC, because that also happened. But I mean, what it really was about ultimately was the the horrific state violence committed by the apartheid government's secret police and military. So this was a very bold and shall we say imperfect attempt at addressing the past. It meant a lot in its time, and it was also very criticized. I can say a bit more about that soon. But it was somehow made possible by a general sense of relief and even euphoria at the way in which the country had succeeded in transitioning to democracy. So there was still a lot of optimism in the air around then. But things have not been all rosy, and there have been many mistakes made by the ANC government. And in 2012, things really came to a head at a platinum mine in northern South Africa, where mine workers have been striking. And there was a terrible massacre perpetrated by the police of these mine workers. And this is by many seen as a watershed moment, when it became apparent that the new ANC government also, not exclusively, but also served the interests of big capital, essentially. And then another watershed moment, which you probably have heard of, is the roads must fall and fees must fall protests. This was largely a campus movement, and it really rocked the universities and had an impact on South Africa at large. And then last year, this is also one of those significant moments. The ANC lost its own majority in parliament and now needs to govern in a coalition with a former opposition party. Right. Next slide, please. Oops. What's happening? Right. Okay. So the 1980s, they were shaped by sort of a mass mobilization against apartheid. The biggest and most important domestic movement then was called UDF, the United Democratic Front. And at that point, it was easy to unite against a common enemy, which was apartheid, the apartheid system, and to envision a post-apartheid South Africa. Next slide, please. But by the 2010s, and this is where we arrive at the roads must fall and fees must fall movements, I see that we're not seeing the full photograph, which is a bit of a pity. I'm not sure why. But this is an image from the very moment, and it's sort of behind her wing. To the right in the picture, you actually see a crane lifting the statue of Rhodes, the notorious imperialist, British imperialist Rhodes. who had a statue on the campus of the University of Cape Town, overlooking the Cape Town, because this is sort of on the slopes of Table Mountain. And this was the culminating moment of these protests in 2015. And there's this performance artist here who it's an iconic image, and it sort of dramatizes this moment when statues lifted from its pedestal, and it's as though the wings represent the new generation that is now soaring. So this had a tremendous impact, and still has, on South Africa. Where what I'm calling it the born freeze. It's, you could say, the South African term for millennials, those who were born, or at least grew up, without really being affected by apartheid. How they, in fact, rebel against their experience of political stasis, the enduring colonial legacy, inequalities in society. And they directed much of their anger at the way they were being taught at universities. So decolonization became a rallying call through these protests, which is very interesting, because that term, decolonization, had never really been current in South Africa. In the 1980s, the whole idea was to struggle against apartheid, but one didn't think of it in terms of decolonization. Next slide, please. So yes, there's, for some reason, the picture is being cropped, but never mind. you can get the gist of what it's saying. So this is just a way to illustrate, returning to this to this figure I've been using to illustrate the differences between the struggle era, as it's known, of the 1980s, where the space of experience was shaped by both a colonial, by that time quite distant colonial, and an apartheid past, and then the struggle of the present, and the horizon of expectation here was clearly that of a post-apartheid future. So there was a lot of hope. It was a very painful time, but there was also a lot of hope. Next slide, please. And today, the mood has definitely shifted. So now there's a space of experience shaped by apartheid and a post-apartheid past, which has turned out to be very imperfect, creating a feeling of disappointment in the present, and a corresponding uncertainty as to what the future actually will hold. So this, in a way, is the point of entry for Hedley Twidell in his book, Experiments with Truth. So next slide, please. Now, a fascinating detail is that this very title is a phrase that Twidell borrows from Gandhi. It occurs in Gandhi's autobiography. And what he's doing here is it's really an excellent book. If you're interested in working on contemporary South African writing, this is one book you absolutely must read. And what it does is identify fundamental trend in recent South African writing, whereby sort of non-fiction and varieties of non-fictive writing have become increasingly important in South African literature. So this is what it says. My account begins from the premise that any simple notion of rivalry between fictive and non-fictive writing is inadequate. It cannot account for the flowering of both the novelistic non-fiction and the historically textured novel writing that has characterized South African writing since the 1990s. Strains of fiction and non-fiction here have for a long time been in an unusually intense, intimate, and constitutive dialogue with each other. So you see here how a thematic thread that has been running through this week's lectures sort of comes together here. If we started with Hayden White and his attempts to understand the ways in which historiography actually was structured as narrative, we see here a development of those ideas that become very, very relevant for literary analysis. Next slide, please. Right. So this, I think, is a very important statement that it makes, that any theorization of non-fiction from the post-colony, and you'll recognize this term now, coined by Achille Mbembe, can hardly forget the need for a truth force that will counter a demeaning objectivity, for frank talk that will contest a racialized knowingness, for vernacular knowledge that will resist official or authoritarian information gathering. This is a very nuanced statement, and it's worth just dwelling on it a bit. He speaks here of a demeaning objectivity, and his point there is, and you have this in the introduction that I assigned to. The point there is that objectivity has also been possible to use as a weapon against the colonized. So that was a point that Frantz Fanon meant. Schematically, one could say that the colonizer stands for objectivity, science, authorized knowledge, and so on, and the colonized only has subjective and imperfect knowledge, or even superstition. That's part of sort of colonial discourse. But there's the important thing here is that Twaddle is not sort of sacrificing truth. It's not saying that, okay, that means that any account is as good as another. Instead, it speaks of this truth force, ways of challenging what power has sort of solidified as objectivity, and that observation can really be directed at all kinds of power structures. It's not sort of exclusive to colonial or apartheid rulers, but it's something that can be relevant in so many other contexts. Next slide, please. So on that basis, following Twidell's observations, one can claim that there have been a number of important literary works, and many more than you see here on this slide, that in significant ways have contributed to sort of revising the national narrative of South Africa. And when I say national narrative, it's kind of paradoxical, because South Africa is really a very fragmented society. There's never been a coherent national community. It has been divided. But even so, this very history of division and conflict has, in its own way, constructed a very strong sense of national national belonging, one could say, and it's in that context it's still relevant to speak of revising the national narrative. The downside is that one could say that South Africans also tend to be quite inward-looking because of the drama and pain of their history. Next slide, please. So, Country of My Skull made quite an impact when it appeared, and this is where we return to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC for short. When she wrote this, she was already a very celebrated poet in Afrikaans, so she belongs to that other half of the white minority, and had a reputation of being quite outspoken and even controversial in her poetry. She also worked as a radio journalist and reported on the TRC for South African radio. And it's on the basis of that experience that she also wrote Country of My Skull. Next slide, please. And it can definitely be described as a work of nonfiction, but it is written with the poet's sort of full investment in language and form. And it is actually quite difficult reading, because I call it here a harrowing book. And it combines documentary material with her own account of her emotional torment as she is confronted with the testimonies, because these testimonies come typically from white Afrikaans-speaking men who had sort of worked for the police or in the military. So it was a very difficult book for her to write, obviously, and it is actually quite a difficult book to read for that reason. I'm just mentioning here because it was like a landmark in the emergence of non-fiction writing that Twidell is talking about. Next slide, please. With native nostalgia, we confront something completely different, I must say. This is also an autobiographical book, and it deals with memory and the past. But if Krog, you could say, fulfills certain expectations, sort of international expectations on South Africa as being this place of horror and violence, which it definitely has been. Dlamini's project in this book was quite different, and he did something very bold here. He wanted to be true to his own memory of growing up in a township outside of Johannesburg, a childhood that he recalled with great fondness. Next slide, please. So this is how he sort of motivates this project. The book should be considered as a modest contribution to ongoing attempts to rescue South African history from the master narrative of Black dispossession that dominates the historiography of the struggle. The master narrative would have us believe that Black South Africans experienced apartheid in the same way and fought the same way against apartheid. That is untrue. So what is he saying here? One way to read it is that the ways in which the struggle against apartheid has been narrated produces simplifications of its own kind. And he is here wanting to say that our experience as Black South Africans was also very differentiated. And we can't be sort of reduced to anonymous masses. And I mean, this was his first book, and since then he's published, for instance, Askari and the Terrorist album. And he, what it does there is precisely to provide narratives that contradict certain expectations on the narrative of South Africa and apartheid, because he's looking not least just at those very dubious figures, those Blacks who were employed by the secret police, for instance, and committed horrible crimes in their day against other Black South Africans. So he's entering extremely difficult sort of moral terrain in those subsequent books. This book, Native Nostalgia, is much brighter in many ways. And it's very much about those early 1970s and what he experienced as a child then. But one can still see a connecting thread between this first book and those later books, where he again quite courageously enters a morally ambivalent domain of South African history. So that is certainly one significant way in which the national narrative is being revised with literary and documentary means. So Dlamini, you could say, he only writes nonfiction. but he does so with also with sort of literary ambitions. Next slide, please. Right, then we come to Ivan Vladislavić, who is a very important name in contemporary South African literature. It would be interesting actually to know if any of you have come across his work, but he's the kind of writer who publishes in very prestigious American literary journals and so on. And this book, a novel, is let me see. I think it was his third novel, but he has written several collections of short stories, as well as essays, and he's a remarkably precise writer, and moving constantly across that boundary of fact and fiction. In this instance, double negative. He wrote the story as he collaborated with a very famous South African photographer, David Goldblatt, whose pictures, particularly of Johannesburg over 6 decades, have been extremely important and also internationally acclaimed. He won the Hasselblad Prize for photography, for instance. And David Goldblatt was putting together a retrospective of his work, and the idea was that Ivan Vladislavić would write like a catalog text to accompany that exhibition. Instead, he wrote a novel, and that became his way to sort of approach Goldblatt's photography and also the numerous implications of photography in South Africa in 3 different historical moments. And there's a narrator here called Neville, and then there's an older fictional photographer, Saul Auerbach, who is, you could say, the fictional version of David Goldblatt. And the narration then unfolds, as I said, in three different moments, the last one being after apartheid. So this is a very inventive way of approaching not only the task of writing fiction, but also of tying different art forms together. And when it was first published, it was actually published together with the book, which contained those images by David Goldblatt that were exhibited. Next slide, please. So here is just one such picture by David Goldblatt, and you can sense here the remarkable precision and elegance of his photography, how he sort of captures this moment with a white boy and a black girl. And Vladislavic's fiction then functions as a response to Goldblatt's photographic legacy, set in a minutely documented Johannesburg. So yes, it's really very powerful and original novel in that way. And we'll be looking at one excerpt so I can give you some better idea. Next slide, please. There we go. So one of the episodes of the novel, Auerbach is being visited by a somewhat obnoxious British journalist who wants to follow his work, and this is during apartheid. And then he dares, when they're standing atop a hill, there are many hills in Johannesburg, looking down on the suburbs. This English journalist dares Auerbach to pick a house and then go down to that house and ask if he can sort of take a picture. And here is the narrator, Neville, describing the picture. And I'll just begin by reading it, and then I will comment on this excerpt. The photograph is one of Auerbach's best. The tender way the woman holds the babies, presenting them in innocent perfection. Her head is turned aside, as if to make clear that the children are the subject of the photograph, but also showing the lovely line of the cheek and hoop in her ear. The twins are identical. You really cannot tell them apart. Behind the mother, over her turned shoulder, is the snapshot of the triplets propped on a wooden crossbeam against the iron wall. It is possible to miss that picture within a picture entirely. But once seen, it looms larger, or you wish it would. It makes you bend your head to the paper, trying to get close, although you know this distance cannot be altered. The third child, the dead one, irreplaceably absent in Auerbach's photograph, persists in that smaller frame like an echo. But who can tell which child it is? The mother could say, perhaps, but she is absent too. In the circle of your eye, they all go on, living and dying, then and now. I think this is a very powerful passage, and there's so much going on here. To begin with, what one knows when reading the novel is that this woman is a servant, a black woman, and under apartheid, it was not uncommon for especially female servants to live in the backyard of the house where they were working. So that is why Auerbach comes across this woman. The fact that he could take this picture can be directly ascribed to sort of white male privilege. The woman could not say no. So already there's something morally equivocal about the situation leading up to the picture. And just to clarify, this photograph is fictional. It is not Goldblatt's. It's a fictional photograph. And then, I mean, it is just worth observing what is happening here in purely sort of poetic terms. I don't know if you're familiar with the phrase ekphrasis, which basically is a technique of describing images with words. And Vladislavić uses this technique a lot in this novel. So through ekphrasis, this fictional photograph that doesn't actually exist becomes present sort of in the mind of the reader. And it provides a different point of entry to remembering the apartheid past. It's really very subtle what's happening here, because Neville, of course, is regarding this photograph in another period. So the photograph is already sort of at a temporal distance, and I think in this way, Vladislavić is demonstrating how photography is another kind of memory compared to, shall we say, the written word, the ways in which written word produces memory. So it provides this illusion of presence, and that's where those last lines come in. In the circle of your eye, they all go on, living and dying, then and now. And there's the pathos there also of the third child that is dead when the picture is taken, but then there's a picture inside the picture where that third child is still alive. So there's a lot going on here in terms of sort of multi-directional temporality. Next slide, please. Yes, so I mentioned that this would be a shorter lecture, and I will end now by reflecting a bit, not only on what I've said now, but also on some of the implications in relation to what I've been saying throughout this week. So, first of all, as I hope I've shown with these three brief examples, South Africa provides some very strong and current examples of how literary writing actively contributes to shaping the understanding of the past. And just as importantly, and I think this is one of the crucial points that Hedley Twiddle makes, the fact-fiction divide is not dissolved. We're not in the terrain of some kind of sheer postmodern relativism here. But it's the interplay between fact and fiction that that produces, shall we say, a synthesis, which one might even call truth, which is a big word, I know. But there's some way in which truth becomes possible to glimpse in that particular interplay. A third point here, and this ties in, of course, also with other things we've been saying, is that South African literary history presents us with a proliferation of temporalities and a rapidly changing dynamic between the space and the horizon. And here I refer especially to those two slides, sort of representing the 1980s and today. Now, the horizon of expectation in the 1980s was really much more optimistic than it is these days. So temporality, in that sense, becomes multi-directional, and is extremely layered. And I think it's fair to ask if it isn't the case that a blurred horizon of expectation also, in fact, energizes literature. South African literature has been thriving, really, these last few decades, in ways that weren't anticipated during apartheid. One of the extremely stupid questions that journalists asked South African writers, especially after 1994, was, okay, what are you going to write about now when apartheid has come to an end? And I would say that South African literature actually is stronger than ever at the moment. It's a very interesting literary field to engage with these days. And then finally, and this I think applies to just about everything I've been saying this week, certainly when it relates to more contemporary literature. We have, I would claim, moved far beyond the older European models of history and progress. So the interesting theoretical question to ask here is if it's time to update Dipesh Chakrabarty. I think he himself would agree, and his work on climate change is kind of an update that he has achieved. But I really think that those statements made in Provincializing Europe about Europe as the sovereign subject of history, and how what we call Indian history, Kenyan history, etc., are really simply versions of the history of Europe in some theoretical sense. I mean, so much has happened in the way we think about history since then that I can't see that it applies any longer. Isabel Hofmeyr's work on the Indian Ocean, and I mean not just hers, but that whole scholarly field opens up completely different lines of connection, different narratives, and we're certainly today living in a moment when Europe as a continent is increasingly sidelined. I mean, our experience these last few weeks is that the United States has become more or less an antagonistic power in relation to Europe. So an update of Chakrabarty would be timely, and in that sense, this our intellectual debates in recent decades also give cause for some optimism, celebration even. Our ways of thinking can change, and history today needs to be thought of as multilinear, as transnational and transcontinental, as ocean-based as much as land-based. And temporality can no longer simply be reduced to one version of progress. So with that, I think I will simply end this this lecture, and you can remove the slides now if you wish.
Thank you, Professor, for this thought-provoking lecture. Since Professor Stefan Helgason has to leave early, participants can drop their questions in the WhatsApp group. These questions will be addressed either on WhatsApp or during tomorrow's tutorial session.